just how it was. The boy's English was self-taught and uneven, peppered with guest appearances from movies and TV, from online games whose players were in America, Europe, and China. When he spoke, he could shift in one moment from the manner of a too-serious Harvard freshman to that of a teenage Shanghai gold farmer sweating in a vast warehouse of machines. On the topic of stories and character, he was particularly donnish and sniffy. "There must be development over time, or it is just noise." And when it appeared that the sergeant was not entirely following this line of discussion, it was one of their earlier conversations, and the older man's education in these matters was not yet properly begun, he had changed tack and demanded whether the sergeant might have any lightweight twine that would work for a kite string, which he had, and had happily given up. The pigeon's head disappeared, and the noises of protest from the pelican's throat began to fade. The boy picked up the comic again and read with his usual intensity. The sergeant leaned back against the stone in such a way as to suggest that the affair had been nothing special, though in all honesty he'd never seen anything to compare with it. They were an unlikely twosome. The man was of medium height and craggy. He was still 6 months shy of 40, but he looked fatigued and even a little lost. His face was leathered by a life of actual soldiering in inclement places, and he had scars about which he was self-conscious. Scars were supposed to be narrow white lines which looked raffish, not puckered worms slithering forever across your shoulder and itching abominably. They should be discreet, so that a man could boast about them to girls. He was thick-set, and some of that was this recent bout of soft living, he had to concede, even if the rest was working heft. But he seemed to move carefully, as if the world was fragile, and he didn't want to break it. The boy, meanwhile, was androgynous in the way of boys, with no fat on his body at all, and scruffy black hair cut short. He seemed to be interested in everything, had a restless intelligence which might even qualify as genius. The sergeant guessed his age as between 10 and 14, but could not narrow the range. There was dust on him always, and often grass stains or splashes of oil. His forearms were corded with child's muscle from whatever work it was that he did, and it seemed he did a bit of everything, when he wasn't reading comic books and spending time with his friend. He wore a long smock which was rather too big on his shoulders, so that on a bad day he looked like a matchstick man in a lampshade. In the late afternoon light, and under the cracked facade of the mission house, he resembled a monk, and the sergeant expected him at any moment to lift his head and preach from the Book of Superman, chapter 9, verse 21. "The world shall know thee as a blur and as a sign upon the heavens, as a hope and an earnest of good things." When the boy had finished reading, he looked up to assure himself that nothing of importance was taking place with the pelican, and then glanced over at the sergeant. It was the hour of the day when they usually went to Shola's and took tea. The island of Mancreu had very few customs left, but tea had somehow clung on, and of all the cafes and bars, and as far as these two were concerned, the remaining living rooms and campsites and samovars as well, Shola's made the best tea. Shola had a proper kettle, and he didn't leave the dregs in the pot or scale in the water. He was a dandy and a gambler, but he knew tea. The sergeant had left his car at the fish market, 10 minutes away along the seafront. This was also customary. Walking along the front allowed him to say hello to everyone. The afternoon greeting was important for social order. Like tea, a British sergeant taking his ease along the promenade was a solid, familiar thing. It said that there was still sense in the world. In theory, of course, the British presence here had been withdrawn 3 years ago, claims of sovereignty having been yielded to the NATO and Allied Protection Force on Mancreu, Nat Pro Man. The sergeant was technically the senior officer, albeit non-commissioned, in the United Kingdom's Mancreu Command, and as a side job, he was